What would you do if you saw something impossible running toward you in the darkness, carrying secrets that could save thousands of lives or doom them to death beneath the waves? Would you trust what your eyes were telling you? Or would you assume exhaustion and fear had finally broken your mind? Before we go any further into this story that was buried in classified files for 8 decades, I need something from you. Drop a comment right now telling me where in the world you're watching from. This channel survives because of viewers like you who care about these hidden histories. Hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear was deliberately erased from official records, and we need your help to keep bringing these stories into the light. The cliffs of Dover have always been waiting and watching. White chalk faces staring across the channel toward France, toward the darkness that gathered there in the spring of 1943, toward the thousands of young men preparing for an invasion that would either save Europe or drown it in blood. The cliffs had witnessed centuries of England's history, had seen Viking longships and Norman vessels and Spanish armadas, had stood silent sentinel over an island that had never fallen to foreign conquest. But they had never seen anything quite like what was coming. They had never held secrets quite so desperate as the ones that would be carved into their ancient stone in the months before D-Day. Captain James Rothwell stood on those cliffs on the night of April 23, 1943, staring into fog that had rolled in from the channel like something alive, something hungry. At 32 years old, he was older than most of the commandos under his command, old enough to have fought in the tail end of the Great War as a boy soldier, young enough to have been called back when this new war erupted and swallowed the world. He was a lean man, all sharp angles and economy of movement, with eyes that had seen too much death to hold illusions about glory or honor. He fought because someone had to fight, because the alternative was unthinkable, because he was good at the terrible arithmetic of warfare, and someone needed to be good at it. His unit, 22nd Independent Company, had been stationed along this stretch of coast for 6 weeks, tasked with monitoring German activity across the Channel, coordinating with French resistance networks, and preparing for operations that they were not yet cleared to know the full details of. They knew only that something massive was being planned, that the invasion everyone spoke of in whispers was closer than the public suspected, that every piece of intelligence they gathered might mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure. The fog made surveillance nearly impossible. It reduced visibility to perhaps 20 feet, turned the cliff tops into isolated islands of existence surrounded by gray nothingness that could hide anything. Sound carried strangely in fog, distorted and redirected, making it impossible to determine direction or distance. Rothwell hated fog, hated the way it made him feel blind and vulnerable, hated the advantage it gave to anyone who might be approaching from the water or the sky. Lieutenant Oscar Pemberton, his second in command, materialized out of the gray like a ghost, moving with the careful silence that commandos learned or died. Pemberton was 24, Cambridge educated, the son of a lord who had horrified his family by volunteering for one of the most dangerous units in the British Army, rather than accepting a safe staff position his father's connections could have secured. He had something to prove, and that made him both valuable and dangerous, the kind of officer who would take risks that might be brilliant or suicidal, depending on how the dice fell. "Nothing from the listening post, sir," Pemberton reported, his voice pitched low. "Radio traffic is quiet. Too quiet, if you ask me. The Germans usually have more chatter at this hour. It feels wrong." Rothwell nodded. Everything felt wrong. The fog, the silence, the way the wind had died completely, leaving the air still and heavy. His instincts, honed by years of combat, were screaming warnings that he could not articulate. Danger without shape or name. Just the certainty that something was happening or about to happen. Something that would change the calculus of whatever fragile security they thought they had. "Double the sentries," he ordered. I want eyes on every approach, fog or no fog, and get word to headquarters that we are on high alert. If something is moving out there, I want to know about it before it knows about us." Pemberton saluted and disappeared back into the fog, and Rothwell was alone again with the cliffs and the silence and the feeling that the night was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The dog appeared at 0300 hours, emerging from the fog like something conjured by the darkness itself. Corporal William Davies saw it first, a shape moving along the cliff edge with impossible speed and purpose, too large to be a fox, too fast to be human. His first instinct was to raise his rifle, finger tightening on the trigger, training overriding thought. But something made him pause, some detail his conscious mind had not yet processed, but his instincts recognized as wrong for a threat. The shape resolved as it drew closer, and Davies found himself staring at a dog, a large German shepherd, running flat out along the cliff path with the kind of desperate speed that suggested flight from something terrible. The animal was exhausted. That much was obvious, even in the poor visibility. Its gait was uneven, favoring its left rear leg. Its coat was matted with mud, and what might have been blood, though Davies could not be certain in the darkness and fog. But what made Davies forget his training, forget everything except the impossible thing he was witnessing, was what the dog was carrying. A harness, military issue by the look of it, strapped around the animal's chest and back, and attached to that harness, secured with careful precision that suggested trained hands, was a metal cylinder, the kind used for carrying documents or maps, the kind that could be waterproofed and weighted to sink if dropped into water. "Hold your fire," Davies called out to the other sentries, his voice carrying urgency but not panic. "Dog approaching. Military harness. Could be one of ours." The German shepherd reached the checkpoint and collapsed, simply folded forward onto its chest, sides heaving with exhaustion that looked close to death. Its tongue lolled from its mouth, pink and swollen. Its eyes, visible now in the light from the guard-post lantern, held something that made Davies's stomach tighten. Not the blank stare of an animal driven by instinct, but something closer to human desperation, pleading without words for help or understanding or mercy. Davies knelt beside the dog, hands hovering over the harness, uncertain whether to touch it. "Get Captain Rothwell," he said to the nearest sentry. "Right bloody now." Rothwell arrived within 3 minutes, Pemberton beside him, both men moving with the controlled urgency of soldiers who had learned to respond to crisis without losing their heads. They stopped 2 feet from where Davies knelt beside the collapsed dog, both officers taking in the scene with eyes that had been trained to assess tactical situations in seconds. The harness was British military issue. That much was immediately clear. The buckles, the stitching, the style, all matched equipment that their own units used for messenger dogs and scout animals. But the dog itself bore no identification tags, no unit markings, nothing that would indicate where it had come from or who had sent it. And the cylinder attached to the harness was sealed with wax that bore a stamp Rothwell did not recognize, though the style suggested official military use. Pemberton reached out carefully, examining the harness without touching the dog. "This animal has come a long way, sir. Look at the wear patterns on the straps, the way the leather is salt-stained. This dog has been in water, probably channel water. And recently. How recently? Hours, sir. Maybe less. The salt is still damp, has not fully dried." Rothwell felt his pulse accelerate, mind racing through implications. A dog, carrying military documents, coming from the direction of France, arriving in the middle of the night during a period of unusual radio silence from German positions. This was either a remarkable piece of intelligence or an elaborate trap, and determining which might mean the difference between saving lives and walking straight into disaster. "Davies, get a medic up here. I want this animal stabilized." Pemberton, secure that cylinder, but do not open it, and someone find me a handler. Anyone in the unit who knows dogs. I want to know if this animal has been trained, and if so, by whom. The medic arrived first, a young Scotsman named Fraser, who had worked as a veterinarian in Glasgow before the war and had been assigned to animal care because the army believed in using whatever expertise its conscripts happened to possess. He examined the German shepherd with gentle hands, checking vitals, examining injuries, assessing the animal's condition with professional competence that Rothwell found reassuring. "She is dehydrated," Fraser reported, his accent making the words lilt and roll. "Exhausted beyond anything I have seen in a working dog. Her pads are torn, bleeding, suggesting miles of hard running on rough terrain. She has a bullet graze along her left flank, maybe 12 hours old, treated but not professionally. And she has been fed recently, within the last 6 hours, but not enough. Someone has been caring for her, but with limited resources." "British or German care?" Rothwell asked. Fraser hesitated, then shook his head. "Cannot say for certain, sir. The field dressing on the bullet wound is competent, but could be either side. The food in her stomach, I would need to analyze it properly to determine origin. But what I can tell you is this. This dog has been trained to an extraordinary level. Her conditioning is military. Her responses suggest months, if not years, of intensive work. And she is loyal to whoever trained her beyond anything normal. You see the way she is still trying to protect that cylinder even though she can barely move? That is not natural behavior. That is training so deep it overrides survival instinct." Rothwell looked at the German shepherd, saw the way the animal's eyes tracked the cylinder, even as Fraser worked on her injuries, saw the tension in her body, despite exhaustion that should have rendered her unconscious. This was a soldier, he realized, as much a soldier as any human in his unit, trained and deployed for a specific mission, driven by loyalty that transcended species. Sergeant Malcolm Hartley appeared from the fog, summoned by a runner who had found him sleeping in the barracks. Hartley was 46 years old, too old for frontline combat, but valuable enough to the war effort that the Army kept him on. Before being conscripted, he had trained dogs for estate security and police work, had a reputation as someone who could communicate with animals in ways that seemed almost supernatural. He looked at the German shepherd with eyes that had assessed hundreds of dogs, thousands probably, and his expression shifted from professional interest to something closer to awe. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. "Where did you find her?" "She found us," Rothwell said. "Came running out of the fog carrying that cylinder. What can you tell me about her?" Hartley knelt beside the dog, not touching but observing, reading signals in her posture and breathing, and the way she held herself. "This is not a British military dog, sir. Our training produces a certain style, certain responses. This animal has been trained somewhere else, by someone who knows methods we do not use. The Germans, probably. Maybe the French resistance using German techniques, but definitely not one of ours." "You are certain?" "Absolutely, sir. Look at the way she is positioned, protecting the cylinder, but also watching all approaches, calculating threats, even in her condition. That is German Schutzhund training, police and military work at the highest level. The Nazis have been breeding these dogs for decades, selecting for intelligence and courage and absolute loyalty. If she is carrying something from occupied France, it means someone sent her deliberately, someone who knew she could make a journey that would kill most animals." Rothwell made a decision, opened the cylinder, carefully. Pemberton broke the wax seal with a knife, working slowly, mindful that the cylinder might be booby-trapped or contain hazardous materials. The seal came away clean, revealing a threaded cap that unscrewed smoothly. Inside, protected by layers of waterproof cloth, were papers, documents written in French, dense text in a careful hand, accompanied by technical drawings that meant nothing to Rothwell but suggested engineering or construction details. And at the top of the first page, written in English in block letters that suggested someone had wanted to ensure the message was immediately understood by whoever opened the cylinder. A single sentence that made Rothwell's blood run cold. The channel is mined. Coordinates follow. Clear before invasion, or thousands will die. Pemberton looked up from the documents, his Cambridge education allowing him to parse the French text faster than Rothwell could manage. Sir, these are specifications for a minefield. German naval mines, hundreds of them, deployed in patterns across shipping lanes that we have been planning to use for the invasion. The coordinates are precise. Depths are listed. Type designations are included. This is complete intelligence, everything we would need to clear the mines before attempting a major naval operation. Where did this come from? How did this dog get these documents? That question would take hours to answer, pieced together from the papers themselves and from intelligence reports that would arrive over the following days as the story became clear. But the essential truth was this. The documents had been compiled by a French engineer named Antoine Mercier, a man who worked for the Toad organization, the German construction group responsible for building coastal fortifications and defensive infrastructure throughout occupied France. Mercier had access to plans for the minefield because his job required him to coordinate with naval units, to ensure that defensive structures did not interfere with mine placement, to make certain that the beaches and waters the Germans intended to defend were properly prepared for the invasion they knew was coming. But Antoine Mercier was also part of the French resistance, had been feeding intelligence to British contacts for 2 years, walking a tightrope between collaboration and sabotage that could end at any moment with a Gestapo interrogation and a bullet in a basement somewhere. He had been waiting for an opportunity to pass information about the minefield, had been gathering specifications and coordinates for months, knowing that this single piece of intelligence could save the invasion, or at least save thousands of lives, if it could reach the right people. The problem was transmission. Radio was too risky, too easy to intercept, too likely to be traced back to him. Dead drops were unreliable, dependent on courier networks that had been compromised repeatedly in recent months. The Germans were tightening security, increasing patrols, using dogs and informants to hunt for resistance members. Normal intelligence channels had become almost suicidal, so Mercier had turned to something desperate, something that seemed insane, but had a chance of working precisely because it was so unlikely. He had turned to a dog. The German shepherd, whose name according to documents found later was Lotte, had been part of a German military kennel in Calais, trained for patrol and guard duty, bonded to a handler who had treated her well and earned the fierce loyalty that German shepherds give to those they trust. But the handler, a young corporal named Klaus Fischer, had been killed in an Allied bombing raid 3 months earlier, and Lotte had been reassigned to kennels awaiting new placement. Mercier had access to those kennels through his construction work. He had watched Lotte, had seen her grieving for her lost handler in the way dogs grieve, with confusion and depression and a waiting that never ends. And he had seen an opportunity, horrible and necessary in equal measure. He had befriended the dog over weeks, bringing food, offering attention, slowly building trust with an animal that was desperate for someone to care about her. And then, when the minefield intelligence was complete, when he knew he had to get the information across the channel no matter the cost, he had taken Lotte from the kennels. Not stolen exactly, because the German military was disorganized enough in their rear areas that a missing dog might not be noticed for days. He had fitted her with a British harness that he had acquired through resistance networks, had sealed the documents in a cylinder, had driven her to a point on the coast where cliffs provided concealment, and the German patrols were thinnest, and he had sent her east, toward England, with nothing but training and loyalty and the desperate hope that she would run until she found British forces, that she would protect the cylinder the way she had been trained to protect equipment, that she would complete a mission she could not possibly understand, because that is what soldiers do, human or animal. The journey had been 27 miles across some of the most heavily defended coastline in Europe, through German patrols and minefields and obstacles designed specifically to prevent exactly this kind of infiltration. Lotte had been spotted twice, shot at once, the bullet that grazed her flank coming from a German sentry who thought he was shooting at a wolf or large fox. She had swum across an inlet, nearly drowning in currents that would have killed a human. She had avoided roads and open ground, moving through hedgerows and forests with the instinct of a wild animal despite training that had suppressed those instincts for years. And she had run. For hours she had run, driven by training and by something else, some understanding that what she carried mattered, that her dead handler would have wanted her to complete this mission. That loyalty demanded she keep moving, even as exhaustion turned her muscles to water, and pain from torn pads made every step agony. She had reached the coast and kept going, climbing cliffs that should have been impossible for an animal her size, finding paths that goats would have struggled with, driven by desperation and duty to reach the top where she could see lights in the distance, where British forces might be found. And she had found them, had collapsed at their feet with the cylinder intact, mission complete, body pushed beyond every reasonable limit to deliver intelligence that would, in the weeks that followed, save thousands of lives. Rothwell read the documents 3 times, comparing coordinates to maps, checking details against intelligence reports they had received through other channels. Everything matched. The patterns made sense. The mine types were consistent with German naval doctrine. This was legitimate intelligence, comprehensive and precise, exactly what Allied planners needed to clear the channel approaches before the invasion. He looked at Lotte, still lying on the ground where Fraser continued working on her injuries, and felt something break open in his chest that he had kept locked away for years of warfare. This animal had saved more lives than most soldiers would in their entire careers, had completed a mission that human agents would have called impossible, had done it alone, without support or backup, driven only by training and loyalty to a handler who was already dead. Pemberton, get these documents to headquarters immediately. Fastest courier we have. Mark them urgent, operational intelligence, invasion planning, and make it clear that the source is a French asset who has put himself at extreme risk to get this information to us. And the dog, sir? Rothwell knelt beside Lotte, reached out carefully, let her smell his hand before touching her head with a gentleness that surprised him. The dog, he said quietly, is a bloody hero. She gets the best care we can provide, and she gets to live. And if I have anything to say about it, she gets recognized for what she has done. Fraser looked up from his work, his expression grim. Sir, I am not certain she will survive. The damage is extensive. Even with the best care, her chances are perhaps 50%. And that is being optimistic. Then you will give her the best care, and you will beat those odds, because that animal just saved the invasion. Do you understand me, Fraser? She does not get to die after what she did. She has earned the right to survive. Fraser nodded, and Rothwell could see in the medic's eyes the same thing he felt himself. A determination that had nothing to do with orders, and everything to do with recognizing something extraordinary, something that transcended the normal calculus of warfare. Lotte represented something that the war had nearly destroyed, a reminder that courage and loyalty and sacrifice were not uniquely human qualities, that the best parts of humanity could be found in creatures that humans too often took for granted. The documents reached London within 6 hours, delivered by motorcycle courier who rode through darkness at speeds that should have killed him, driven by orders that made it clear lives depended on his speed. Naval intelligence analyzed the intelligence, verified it against other sources, confirmed its authenticity with a certainty that made planners simultaneously grateful and terrified. The minefield was real. The coordinates were accurate. The danger was imminent. And the mines had been placed precisely along routes that Allied planners had designated as primary invasion channels, suggesting either remarkable German foresight or a security breach that had allowed them to anticipate where the attack would come. Either way, attempting an invasion through those waters without clearing the mines first would have been catastrophic. Losses in the thousands before troops ever reached the beaches. Ships sunk in formations that would create chaos and make coordinated assault nearly impossible. Mine clearance operations began immediately, conducted in absolute secrecy under cover of routine naval exercises and weather reconnaissance missions. Specialized vessels equipped with magnetic and acoustic mine detection equipment swept the designated areas, marking locations, developing clearance patterns, working with the desperate urgency of men who knew that delays cost lives, but rushing cost lives as well. The operation took 3 weeks, identifying and neutralizing over 400 mines spread across shipping lanes and approach vectors that would be critical to invasion success. 4 minesweepers were damaged in the process. 7 sailors died when a mine detonated prematurely during defusal. But the lanes were cleared, verified clear, marked and mapped with precision that would allow invasion fleets to navigate safely when the time came. And throughout those 3 weeks, Lotte fought her own battle, lying in a converted stable that Fraser had transformed into a makeshift veterinary clinic. She developed infections that nearly killed her twice. She stopped eating, had to be fed intravenously, watched over constantly by Fraser and a rotation of soldiers who volunteered to sit with her, who talked to her, and stroked her fur, and willed her to live with the same intensity they brought to combat. Rothwell visited daily, standing beside the dog, updating her on events as though she could understand, as though his words might give her reason to keep fighting. "They are clearing the mines," he told her on the 8th day, when fever had broken, and Fraser thought she might actually survive. "Because of you, because of what you carried. Thousands of men will live because you ran through the darkness and did not give up. You understand that. You saved them. You saved all of them." Lotte's eyes tracked him as he spoke, brown and deep and holding something that looked like understanding, or perhaps just reflected the concern in his own expression. Her tail, which had been motionless for days, twitched once, the smallest movement, barely perceptible, but enough to make Rothwell's throat tighten with emotion he had not allowed himself to feel since the war began. On the 14th day, Lotte stood, not easily, not without pain that made Fraser wince in sympathy, but she stood on legs that trembled with weakness, but held her weight. She took 3 steps toward the stable door, toward sunlight that streamed through cracks in the wood, toward a world she had nearly left behind. And then she looked back at Fraser with eyes that asked a question he understood without words. "Where is my handler? Where is the person I am supposed to protect?" Fraser had no answer that a dog could understand. He could only kneel beside her and stroke her head, and promise that she was safe now, that people cared about her, that she had done her job and earned rest. But he knew, with the certainty that came from years of working with animals, that Lotte would never truly rest. She had been trained to serve, bonded to a handler who was dead, sent on a mission that had broken something fundamental in her understanding of the world. She had survived, but survival was not the same as healing. The intelligence from the documents proved even more valuable than initial assessments suggested. As analysts in London studied Mercier's specifications, they realized the minefield was part of a larger defensive strategy, a coordinated system of obstacles designed to channel invasion forces into killing zones where German artillery and air power could inflict maximum damage. The mines were not randomly placed, but arranged in patterns that revealed German assumptions about where and how the Allies would attack. This knowledge allowed invasion planners to adjust their approach, to select landing zones that the Germans had considered less likely and therefore defended less heavily. It allowed naval commanders to develop routes that avoided not just the mines, but the entire defensive architecture those mines were meant to support. The intelligence, combined with information from other sources, helped shape what would eventually become Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion that would turn the tide of the war. But the cost of that intelligence weighed heavily on everyone who knew the full story. Antoine Mercier disappeared 3 days after Lotte reached England. Gestapo records later recovered would show that he was arrested on April 26, 1943, questioned about resistance activities and unauthorized access to military installations, tortured for information about his networks and contacts, and executed on May 2nd in the basement of a converted hotel in Calais. He never revealed anything about the dog or the documents or the minefield intelligence. Even under torture that broke bones and burned flesh and pushed him beyond any reasonable expectation of human endurance, he protected his sources and his mission. The Germans knew someone had stolen papers, knew someone had betrayed military secrets, but they did not know what papers or which secrets or how the information had been transmitted. They tightened security, changed some procedures, moved some mine positions, but they did not clear the entire field or abandon their defensive strategy because they did not know how much had been compromised. Mercier died without knowing if his mission had succeeded, without knowing if Lotte had reached British lines, without knowing if the documents would arrive in time to matter. He died alone in darkness, holding on to loyalty and courage when every rational reason for both had been stripped away by pain and fear and the certainty of death. Rothwell learned of Mercier's execution through intelligence channels 2 weeks after it happened. A brief notation in a report about Gestapo activities in Calais, a name and a date, and the word executed with no details that might have made the abstract concrete, the statistic human. But Rothwell knew what it meant, knew that the man who had saved the invasion had died for it, knew that the courage that had sent Lotte running through the darkness had been paid for in blood and agony in a basement that would never appear in any memorial or history book. He went to see Lotte that evening, found her lying in straw that Fraser had changed that morning, eyes open but distant, watching shadows move across the stable walls. He sat beside her, and for a long time neither of them moved, human and animal sharing space and silence, and something that might have been grief, or might have been the recognition that war asked for sacrifices that could never be adequately honored. "Your handler is dead," Rothwell said finally, speaking quietly, as though Lotte could understand not the words, but the intention behind them. "The man who sent you, the man who gave you this mission, they killed him. He died protecting what you carried, died protecting you. And I need you to understand something. He succeeded. What you did, what he did, it mattered. You saved thousands of lives, thousands of men who will never know your name or his name, who will go home to families and futures because of what you two accomplished together." Lotte's tail moved slightly, acknowledging his presence without real enthusiasm. She was healing physically, but remained distant, disconnected, going through motions of existence without engaging with life. Fraser worried about her constantly, tried different foods and exercises and techniques to bring her back, but nothing seemed to reach whatever part of her had broken during that run through the darkness. Pemberton suggested that perhaps she needed a new handler, someone to bond with, someone to give her purpose beyond simple survival. But when they tried introducing her to various soldiers, men who knew dogs and wanted to help, Lotte showed no interest. She tolerated their presence but sought no connection, remained polite but removed, a soldier waiting for orders that would never come from a commander who was already dead. It was Corporal William Davies who finally reached her, not through expertise or training, but through simple, persistent presence. He began spending his off-duty hours in the stable, not trying to interact with Lotta, just being there. He would sit against the wall and read letters from home, talk about his life in Wales before the war, describe his family's farm and the dogs they had kept, border collies mostly, who herded sheep across hills that seemed to stretch forever, under gray skies that reminded him of the cliffs. He talked about his youngest brother, Samuel, who was 10 years old and obsessed with dogs, who wrote letters asking William to describe every animal he encountered, who drew pictures of German shepherds based on descriptions in books, and sent them in envelopes that arrived smelling of home and innocence and a world that still existed, despite everything the war was doing to destroy it. "I told Samuel about you," Davies said one evening, sitting in his usual spot, while Lotta lay in straw, and pretended not to listen. "Told him about the bravest dog I ever met. Told him how you ran through enemy territory, carrying secrets that saved thousands of lives. He drew you a picture. Want to see it?" He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, smoothed it out carefully, held it up so Lotta could see if she chose to look. The drawing was crude, the way children's drawings are crude, all simple lines and enthusiastic color, but it captured something essential. A German shepherd running along a cliff top, harness visible, determination in every line despite the technical limitations of a 10-year-old's artistic ability. And at the bottom, in careful letters that suggested adult help with spelling, a message. "Thank you for saving my brother. Love, Samuel Davies, age 10. Lotta lifted her head, stared at the drawing with an intensity that made Davies catch his breath. She stood slowly, moved across the stable with the careful deliberation of an animal still recovering from injuries, came to sit directly in front of Davies, close enough that he could feel warmth from her body, close enough that when she finally looked up at him, her eyes seemed to ask a question that he desperately wanted to answer correctly. He reached out carefully, let her smell his hand, felt the moment she decided to trust him as clearly as if she had spoken aloud. She leaned forward, pressed her head against his chest, and released something that had been held tight inside her since the moment her original handler died. Not tears, because dogs do not cry the way humans cry, but grief given physical form, tension flowing out of her body as she allowed herself to finally rest. Davies wrapped his arms around her and held on while she shook, while something fundamental shifted in the space between them, while soldier and dog found in each other what they both needed: purpose beyond individual survival, connection that transcended the horror and loneliness that war created with such terrible efficiency. From that day forward, Lotta was Davies's dog, bonded with the fierce loyalty that German shepherds give when they choose to trust again after betrayal. She followed him during his duties, slept outside his barracks, positioned herself between him and any potential threats with the protective instinct that her training had created and her experience had reinforced. She was still damaged, still carried scars both physical and psychological that would never fully heal. But she had found a reason to engage with life again, a person worth protecting, a mission that made survival meaningful. Rothwell watched the transformation with satisfaction that was tinged with something darker, an understanding that what had saved Lotta would eventually put her and Davies both at risk. Because Commandos did not keep pets. Because dogs in combat units were tools to be deployed and sacrificed if necessary. Because the same loyalty that had saved Lotta's life could eventually demand payment that neither she nor Davies might be willing to make. But for now, in the spring of 1943, with the invasion still months away and the cliffs of Dover still standing watch over waters that had been cleared of mines that should have killed thousands, Rothwell allowed himself to believe that perhaps this one story might have a happy ending. Perhaps this one dog and this one soldier might survive what was coming. Perhaps courage and loyalty and sacrifice might be rewarded with something other than death and memory and names carved into stone memorials that most people would walk past without reading. The documents from Mercier's cylinder became part of a larger intelligence picture that grew clearer as the months progressed. Resistance networks across France reported on German fortifications, troop movements, supply lines, defensive preparations. The picture that emerged was both encouraging and terrifying. The Germans expected invasion, had prepared extensively for it, but their preparations revealed assumptions that could be exploited, weaknesses that could be attacked, calculations that were not quite correct, and central to all of it, foundational to planning that would eventually move millions of tons of equipment and hundreds of thousands of men across the Channel. Were those mine coordinates, those precise locations that allowed naval planners to develop routes, that gave engineers time to prepare clearance operations, that provided certainty in a situation where uncertainty could mean catastrophic failure? In late May, as spring turned toward summer and preparations for invasion accelerated beyond anything that could be concealed, Rothwell received orders transferring his unit to advanced training for amphibious operations. They would be part of the invasion when it came, among the first waves to hit the beaches, Commandos tasked with securing positions and disrupting German responses, while main forces established beachheads. The orders specified that no animals would accompany the unit. Dogs, horses, pigeons, all the living tools that modern militaries had come to depend on, would be left behind or transferred to other units. The invasion would be mechanized, coordinated, dependent on timing and logistics that could not accommodate the unpredictability of animal behavior under fire. Davies read the orders and looked at Lotta, who sat beside him watching with eyes that seemed to understand that change was coming, that the fragile stability they had built together was about to be tested. He had known this moment would arrive eventually, had known that war would demand choices he did not want to make, separations he was not prepared for, losses that would break something he had worked so hard to rebuild. "Sir," he said to Rothwell that evening, standing at attention in the captain's temporary office, "I am requesting permission to leave Lotta with my family. My mother has agreed to take her, care for her, keep her safe, until I return." Rothwell studied the young corporal, saw in his expression the same thing he felt himself, the desperate need to believe that what they protected might survive, that loyalty and courage might be preserved beyond the immediate demands of warfare. "Permission granted," he said quietly. "Send her home, Davies. Send her somewhere safe. She has done her part. She has earned peace. Whatever peace is possible in this world we have made." The arrangements took 2 weeks, coordinating transport and paperwork and the 1,000 small details that moving a dog from military control to civilian custody required. Davies spent every available moment with Lotta, training her to respond to his mother's voice and commands, helping her understand that this new person was safe, was trusted, was someone worth protecting the way she had learned to protect him. On the morning of June 2nd, 1943, Davies walked Lotta to the transport truck that would carry her north to Wales, to hills and sheep, and a farmhouse where his brother Samuel waited with excitement that had turned their mother's letters into barely controlled chaos of anticipation. He knelt beside Lotta one last time, held her head between his hands, looked into eyes that had seen too much suffering, but still held capacity for trust. "You take care of them," he said, voice breaking slightly despite his efforts to maintain composure. "You protect Samuel the way you protected me. You understand? You are not done yet. You still have a mission. You keep my family safe until I come home." Lotta licked his face once, a gesture of affection rare enough that Davies knew she understood this was goodbye, or at least goodbye for now, that the future was uncertain, and promises were dangerous, but necessary despite danger. He stood, stepped back, watched as handlers loaded her into the truck with care that suggested Rothwell had made it very clear this particular animal was to be treated with respect, bordering on reverence. The truck pulled away, and Davies stood watching until it disappeared into distance and fog that had rolled in from the channel, watching until there was nothing left to see but gray emptiness that could hide anything, watching until Pemberton touched his shoulder and reminded him gently that they had duties to attend to, preparations to make, an invasion to survive if they were lucky, and die in if they were not. Lotte arrived in Wales on June 4th, delivered to a farmhouse that sat on a hillside overlooking valleys that seemed carved from ancient stone and living green, land that had been farmed for generations and would be farmed for generations more if the war did not consume everything. Samuel Davies was waiting at the gate, practically vibrating with excitement, barely able to contain himself, as handlers opened the truck and led Lotte down a ramp that seemed designed for animals much larger. "She is beautiful," Samuel whispered, staring at Lotte with awe that made the handlers smile, despite their urgency to return to base. "She is the most beautiful dog I have ever seen." Lotte regarded the boy with careful assessment, reading his posture and tone and the open friendliness that radiated from him like warmth from fire. She took 3 steps forward, sniffed his extended hand, made a decision that would shape the rest of both their lives. She sat beside Samuel, close enough that he could touch her, and appointed herself his guardian with the same absolute commitment she had given to Klaus Fischer, and then to William Davies. Samuel threw his arms around her neck and laughed, pure joy uncontaminated by war or loss, or the knowledge that happiness was fragile. And for the first time since arriving in England, Lotte's tail wagged with something approaching enthusiasm. Margaret Davies, William's mother, watched from the farmhouse door and felt tears on her face that she did not bother to hide. She understood what she was seeing, understood that this dog represented her son's attempt to keep his family safe, while he went to fight in a war that was consuming the world. She understood the weight of that trust, the responsibility that came with accepting care of an animal that had saved thousands of lives and deserved safety and peace and whatever small happiness could be carved from these terrible years. She approached slowly, offered her hand for Lotte to inspect, spoke in the gentle tones that had soothed frightened lambs and injured animals for 40 years of farm life. "Welcome home, Lotte. You are safe here. You are wanted here. And I promise on everything I hold sacred, that we will take care of you the way my son would want. You are family now. Do you understand? You are family." Lotte looked at Margaret, at Samuel, at hills that rolled away into distance under sky that was clearing to blue, and something in her posture shifted, not completely, not erasing the damage and trauma and loss that had carved themselves into her, but softening slightly, opening to the possibility that perhaps survival might be enough, that perhaps the war had not taken everything, that perhaps there was still room in the world for dogs and children, and families who tried to protect each other despite everything. The invasion came on June 6, 1944, 1 year and 4 days after Lotte arrived in Wales. Operation Overlord, D-Day, the largest amphibious assault in history, hundreds of thousands of men crossing the channel in ships that navigated through waters that had been cleared of mines, approaching beaches that had been scouted and mapped and analyzed through intelligence gathered at terrible cost by people whose names would never appear in official histories. Rothwell and his commandos were in the first wave, hitting beaches at dawn, fighting through obstacles and fire and chaos that turned careful planning into desperate improvisation. Davies was beside him, had survived training and preparation and the crossing itself, had made it to French sand and moved inland with the focused determination of a soldier who had promises to keep. He survived the first day, survived the first week, survived the brutal fighting that followed as Allied forces pushed inland against German resistance that was fierce and professional and ultimately insufficient to stop what was coming. He survived long enough to write letters home, to tell Samuel about France and victory, and the knowledge that they were winning, that the sacrifices were worth it, that soon the war would be over, and he would come home to Wales and hills, and a dog that he missed more than he could express. He died on July 23, 1944, during fighting near Caen, killed by artillery fire that made identification difficult and burial hasty. Another name on casualty lists that seemed to stretch forever. Another family's grief added to the weight of war that grew heavier with each passing day. The notification arrived in Wales on August 1st, delivered by an army chaplain who had performed this duty too many times to count, but still felt each one like a wound. Margaret Davies took the news standing in her kitchen, surrounded by the mundane details of farm life that continued despite everything, and felt something break inside her that would never fully heal. Samuel was with Lotta in the yard, throwing a stick that she retrieved with enthusiasm that had grown over months of safety and routine, and Margaret stood at the window watching them and trying to find words that would destroy her son's innocence, that would teach him the hardest lesson childhood can learn, that people you love can be taken from you, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. Nothing you can do except endure. She waited until evening, until after dinner, until the chaplain had left and darkness had fallen, and she had cried herself into a numbness that felt like the only way she could function. She called Samuel inside, sat him down, held his hands, and told him with words that came from somewhere beyond thought that his brother was dead, that William would not be coming home, that the dog he had sent to protect them would have to be enough. Samuel did not cry at first, did not speak, just sat staring at nothing while his world reorganized itself around this new, terrible knowledge. And then he looked at Lotta, who had followed him inside and sat pressed against his leg the way she did when she sensed distress, and something in his face crumpled. He did not come home, Samuel whispered. He sent Lotta, but he did not come home. No, Margaret said, pulling her son close, feeling him shake against her. No, my love, he did not, but he loved you, and he wanted you to be safe. And Lotta is here because of that love. Do you understand? Every day we have her. Every day she protects you. That is your brother still keeping his promises. Samuel buried his face in Lotta's fur and sobbed, 10 years old, and learning what loss means, learning that war takes more than lives. It takes futures and possibilities, and the innocent belief that good people are protected by goodness. And Lotta held still, pressed against him, offering the only comfort she knew how to give, presence and warmth, and the promise that she would not leave, that she would keep protecting him the way she had been trained and commanded and chosen to do. The war ended 10 months later. Germany surrendered. Celebrations erupted across Britain and Europe and the world. Soldiers came home to families that had waited through years of fear and uncertainty. But William Davies was not among them. His body was buried in France, in a military cemetery that held thousands of men who had died liberating a continent. Row upon row of white markers that testified to the cost of freedom and the price of defeating evil. Samuel grew up with Lotta beside him, grew from boy to teenager to young man, while the dog aged from prime to middle years to the gray-faced dignity of elderly animals who have seen much and survived more. She was his constant companion through grief and healing, through the slow process of learning to remember his brother with love instead of pain, through adolescence and young adulthood, and the 1,000 small moments that constitute a life. He became a teacher, moved to Cardiff, brought Lotta with him to a small flat that probably did not allow dogs, but whose landlord made an exception when Samuel explained who Lotta was and what she had done. He introduced her to students as the bravest dog in the world, told them her story in terms appropriate for children, watched as they stared at this elderly German shepherd with awe that made the past real in ways that textbooks never could. Lotte died on November 11th, 1953, Armistice Day, as though she had waited for a date that held meaning beyond personal convenience. She was 14 years old, ancient for a working dog, and she died peacefully in her sleep beside Samuel's bed, the same way she had slept every night for a decade, guardian to the end. Samuel buried her in his mother's garden in Wales, on the hillside where she had spent her happiest years, overlooking valleys that stretched away into distance. He marked the grave with a stone he carved himself, working with hands that his brother had once taught to hold tools properly, inscribing words that felt inadequate but necessary. Lotte, war dog, hero. She kept her promises. The story should have ended there, with a grave on a hillside and a man grieving for a dog who represented his last living connection to a brother he had lost. But stories about war dogs, about animals who carry secrets and save lives, and bind themselves to humans with loyalty that transcends reason, these stories have a way of continuing, of refusing to stay buried under soil and time, and the deliberate forgetting that comes after war's end. In 1997, a historian researching British commando operations during World War II encountered a reference in declassified documents to a German shepherd that had carried minefield intelligence across enemy lines, intelligence that had been credited with preventing catastrophic casualties during the D-Day invasion. The reference was brief, frustratingly lacking in detail, but it included a name: Lotte. The historian, a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Brennan, who specialized in unconventional intelligence operations, began to trace the story. She found Rothwell's after-action reports, discovered references to Davies and the dog he had sent to Wales, located Samuel Davies, still living in Cardiff at 74 years old, still teaching occasionally as a substitute, still telling students about the bravest dog he had ever known. She interviewed Samuel over several months, recorded his memories, gathered letters and photographs, and the few documents that had survived decades of moves and life changes. She researched Antoine Mercier, finding his name in Gestapo execution records, piecing together his role in the resistance and his sacrifice. She traced the mine clearance operations, confirmed that the intelligence from Lotte's cylinder had been instrumental in saving thousands of lives, and she published a book in 2001 titled The Guardian of the Cliffs that told the complete story for the first time. The book was modestly successful, reviewed well in academic journals and military history publications, bought by libraries and military enthusiasts, and people who appreciated stories about animals who performed extraordinary deeds in terrible circumstances. But it did something else, something that Dr. Brennan had not anticipated. It reached the descendants of Antoine Mercier, specifically his granddaughter, a woman named Sophie Mercier-Laurent, who lived in Paris and had spent her life wondering about the grandfather she had never met, who had died before she was born, and whose story her family knew only in fragments. Sophie traveled to England, met Samuel, stood beside Lotte's grave and wept for the dog she had never known, but who represented her grandfather's courage and sacrifice. She and Samuel became friends, unlikely companions bound by shared history, and the recognition that their families had been forever linked by events that happened before either of them were born. Together, they established a small memorial in Dover, on the cliffs where Lotte had emerged from the fog, carrying secrets that changed history. The memorial was simple, a bronze plaque mounted on stone, inscribed with words that Sophie and Samuel had labored over for months, trying to capture something true about sacrifice and loyalty and the quiet heroes who never sought recognition. In memory of Lotte, War Dog, and Antoine Mercier, French resistance, whose courage and sacrifice saved thousands of lives during the liberation of Europe. Also in memory of Corporal William Davies, British Commandos, who gave his life defending the freedom that others take for granted. May we never forget what they did. May we prove worthy of their sacrifice. The memorial was dedicated on June 6, 2004, the 60th anniversary of D-Day, in a ceremony attended by veterans and historians and families of men who had fought in the invasion. Samuel was 81 years old, frail but determined, insisting on attending, despite health problems that made travel difficult. He stood beside the memorial and spoke briefly about his brother, and about Lotta, and about the price that had been paid for freedom that most people never had to think about. And he revealed something that he had kept private for decades, a detail that he had never shared with Dr. Brennan or anyone else outside his family. Lotta had been pregnant when she made her run across occupied France. The stress and trauma had caused her to miscarry days after reaching British lines, losing a litter that might have carried forward the bloodline of an animal whose courage deserved to be remembered in more than words. He said this quietly, almost as an aside, but it reached people in the audience in ways that larger revelations could not, because it suggested sacrifice beyond what anyone had imagined, suffering beyond what was necessary to complete her mission. Lotta had not just risked her life, but had lost potential future, had paid a price that went beyond physical wounds and psychological trauma. An elderly veteran in the audience, a man named Robert Sheffield, who had been part of the mine clearance operations in 1943, approached Samuel after the ceremony. He was crying, tears running down weathered cheeks, and when he spoke, his voice shook with emotion that 60 years had not diminished. "I was there," he said. "I was one of the men clearing those mines. We worked for weeks, knowing that if we missed even one, it could sink a ship, kill hundreds. And all that time we knew someone had died to get us that intelligence. We knew the coordinates were bought with blood, but we did not know about the dog. We did not know about Lotta. And now I do. And I need you to understand something. Every man who survived D-Day, every man who made it to the beaches because those mines were cleared, we all owe our lives to that dog and to the people who loved her enough to ask the impossible." Samuel embraced the old veteran, two men who had survived the war in different ways, holding each other while around them the ceremony continued, and the cliffs of Dover stood watch over waters that had carried so much death and fear and courage across their depths. Dr. Brennan updated her book in 2007, adding Sophie's research about Antoine Mercier and new details about the mine clearance operations. The second edition included photographs of the memorial, transcripts of Samuel's speech, interviews with veterans who had participated in the invasion. It became required reading in several military academies, used as a case study in unconventional intelligence operations and the human-animal bond in combat situations. But more importantly, it inspired other researchers to look for similar stories, to excavate histories that had been buried or forgotten or deliberately concealed. Dogs who had carried messages through artillery fire, dogs who had detected mines that would have killed their handlers, dogs who had guided soldiers through darkness or warned of ambushes, or simply provided companionship that made survival bearable. A database was created, compiled by volunteers and military historians, cataloging war dogs from World War II and subsequent conflicts. Lotta's entry became one of the most detailed, including her German training records that were recovered from captured archives, witness statements from soldiers who had encountered her, and genetic analysis that suggested her bloodline continued in modern working dog populations despite the miscarriage that had ended her direct line. Samuel Davies died in 2011, at 88 years old, surrounded by family that included children and grandchildren who had grown up hearing stories about Uncle William and the dog that had saved thousands of lives. His funeral was attended by military historians and veterans and people who had been moved by Lot's story, who understood that some debts can never be repaid, but must be acknowledged and remembered. He was buried beside his brother, in France, in the military cemetery where William had lain for 67 years. The French government provided permission for the exceptional burial, recognizing that the brothers should rest together, that Samuel had earned his place among the men who had died freeing Europe, even though he had never fired a shot in combat. Sophie Mercier-Laurent spoke at the funeral, reading a letter that her grandfather had written to her grandmother shortly before his arrest. A letter that had survived the war, hidden in a barn wall and discovered decades later during renovations. The letter spoke of hope and fear and love that transcended the immediate horror of occupation and resistance, and it mentioned a dog. Just briefly, in a postscript that suggested afterthought or perhaps deliberate vagueness, meant to protect secrets if the letter was intercepted. "I have sent our best soldier east," Mercier wrote. "She carries hope for thousands. I pray she makes it. I pray someone cares enough to finish what we started." The words hung in the air above two graves, above assembled witnesses who had come to honor a teacher and a soldier and a dog, hung there like blessing or command or simply statement of truth that needed to be spoken aloud and acknowledged. Someone had cared enough. Lotta had made it. Thousands had survived because of what she carried and what she endured to carry it. In 2019, on the 75th anniversary of D-Day, the British government officially recognized Lotta's contribution to the war effort, awarding her posthumously the Dickin Medal, the highest honor available to animals in military service. The medal, known as the Animals Victoria Cross, had been established in 1943 specifically to recognize animals whose bravery and devotion to duty saved human lives during wartime. The ceremony was held in London, attended by dignitaries and military officials and descendants of people whose stories had intersected with Lotta's. Sophie Mercier-Laurent accepted the medal on Lotta's behalf, standing beside a photograph of the dog that had been enlarged to poster size, showing Lotta in her prime, alert and strong and beautiful, in the way that working dogs are beautiful, all purpose and capability, and the fierce devotion that comes from training and breeding and individual character. Sophie spoke briefly, her English accented but clear, about her grandfather and about Lotta, and about the price that had been paid for freedoms that modern generations too often took for granted. "My grandfather died so that a dog could carry secrets," she said. "That dog nearly died delivering those secrets, and a young man in Wales grew up without his brother so that the world could be free of tyranny. These are not abstractions. These are real people, real animals, real sacrifices that should never be forgotten. And I stand here today not to celebrate war, because war is horror and should be avoided whenever possible, but to honor the courage and love and loyalty that can exist even in the worst circumstances, to honor my grandfather and Lotta and William Davies and all the others whose names we do not know, but whose sacrifices made our lives possible." The applause was long and heartfelt, and when it finally faded, an elderly woman in the audience stood and began to sing. Her voice was thin with age, but clear, carrying across the assembled crowd with surprising strength. She sang "The White Cliffs of Dover," the wartime anthem that had promised hope during Britain's darkest hours, and gradually others joined her until the entire audience was singing, remembering, bearing witness to the past and its lessons. The medal now resides in the Imperial War Museum in London, displayed alongside other Dickin Medal recipients, part of an exhibit about animals in warfare that attracts thousands of visitors each year. Lotta's story is told through photographs and documents and a video presentation that includes interviews with Samuel Davies recorded before his death, with Sophie Mercier-Laurent, with veterans who participated in the mine clearance operations, with historians who have studied her contribution and its impact on the invasion. And beside the medal, in a small brass urn, are Lotta's ashes. Samuel had kept them for decades, unable to fully let go, but in his will he specified that they should be placed in the museum, that Lotta should rest among other heroes, that her story should be available to anyone who wanted to understand what courage and loyalty meant when the world was on fire and every choice mattered. Children visit the exhibit, stare at photographs of a beautiful German shepherd, read about her journey across occupied France and her collapse on Dover's cliffs. They ask questions that their parents struggle to answer. Why did she do it? Did she know she was saving people? Did it hurt? And the parents do their best, explaining about training and loyalty and the bond between humans and animals, trying to make sense of something that transcends easy explanation. But sometimes, watching these interactions, museum staff notice something interesting. The children seem to understand in ways that adults struggle with. They accept that Lotta was brave because she had to be, that she ran because someone she trusted told her to run, that she did not need to understand the larger strategic implications to know that what she carried was important and worth protecting. They understand, in the simple, clear way that children understand things before the world teaches them to be cynical, that love and loyalty are not weaknesses, but strengths, that protecting others is worth suffering for, that some promises must be kept, no matter the cost. In Dover, on the cliffs where Lotta emerged from fog, carrying secrets that changed history, tourists stop to read the memorial plaque that Sophie and Samuel placed there. Most of them take photographs, post them to social media with brief comments about moving stories or brave dogs or the price of freedom. A few linger longer, reading the words multiple times, letting them sink in deeper than surface sentiment. And occasionally, someone comes who knows the full story, who has read Dr. Brennan's book, or visited the museum exhibit, or simply carries within them an understanding of what war costs and what it asks. These people stand beside the memorial for longer periods, sometimes touching the bronze plaque as though contact might create connection across decades, sometimes simply staring out at the channel that Lotta crossed at such terrible price. They stand there and remember, or try to remember, or commit themselves to remembering, because memory is the only payment we can offer for debts that can never truly be repaid. They stand there and bear witness, continuing the vigil that Lotta began when she refused to abandon what she had been sent to protect. And if you listen carefully, if you stand on those cliffs when fog rolls in from the channel and the wind carries salt spray and the echoes of old wars, you might hear something that sounds like footsteps, like paws on stone, like a dog running through darkness toward a light that promises safety and understanding, and the completion of a mission that transcends death and time, and the forgetting that comes so easily to those who were not there. You might hear Lotta still running, still protecting, still keeping promises made by a French resistance fighter and a British soldier and a young boy in Wales who grew up understanding that love requires sacrifice, and sacrifice requires remembrance. You might hear her, and if you do, I pray you stop and listen. I pray you remember. I pray you understand that the freedom you enjoy, the peace you take for granted, the ability to live without fear of occupation or tyranny, or the knock on the door in the middle of the night, all of this was bought with blood and courage and sacrifices like Lotta's. Remember Antoine Mercier, who died in a basement in Calais protecting secrets he would never know were delivered safely. Remember William Davies, who survived D-Day only to die weeks later in fighting that has been reduced to paragraphs in history books. Remember Samuel Davies, who lost his brother but kept his brother's dog and spent his life teaching children about courage and loyalty and the price of freedom. Remember Margaret Davies, who raised her surviving son alone and cared for a war dog with patience and love that helped heal wounds no doctor could treat. Remember Robert Sheffield and the men who cleared mines in darkness, knowing that mistakes meant death, working with precision, born from knowledge that every mine they missed could kill hundreds. Remember all of them. Remember that wars are not won by generals and politicians, but by ordinary people who do extraordinary things because someone must, because the alternative is unthinkable, because love and loyalty and duty demand action even when action means suffering. And remember Lotte, who ran through occupied France carrying secrets that saved thousands, who collapsed on cliffs that still bear witness to her courage, who gave everything, including the future she might have had, because that is what soldiers do, human or animal, when the mission demands sacrifice, and someone must be willing to make it. The war ended 70 years ago, but its lessons remain urgent. Evil does not announce itself with swastikas and goose-stepping armies anymore. It comes in subtler forms, hiding behind justifications and rationalizations, and the simple human tendency to look away from suffering that does not directly affect us. It comes when we forget that freedom requires vigilance, that peace requires work, that justice requires people willing to stand against injustice even when standing is dangerous. Lotte could not have understood these abstractions. She was a dog, driven by training and loyalty and the simple need to complete her mission. But in her actions, in her refusal to quit, despite injury and exhaustion and terror, she demonstrated truths that humans often forget. That duty matters, that loyalty matters, that some things are worth dying for, and in the end, perhaps that is the deepest lesson her story teaches. Not that dogs are noble, or that war is glorious, or that sacrifice is beautiful, but that love, real love, the kind that binds us to each other and demands we protect what matters, even when protection costs everything, that love is stronger than fear, stronger than death, stronger than all the forces that try to convince us that nothing matters, that caring is weakness, that looking out for ourselves is the only rational choice. Lotte ran through darkness because someone loved her and trusted her and asked her to carry hope across an abyss. She made it. She delivered that hope. She saved thousands of people who never knew her name and never had the chance to thank her. And in doing so, she proved that one individual, even one dog, can change the world if they refuse to quit, refuse to abandon what they have been entrusted to protect, refuse to let fear and pain and exhaustion become excuses for failure. So when you stand on those cliffs in Dover, when you visit the memorial or the museum, when you read this story and feel something stir in your chest, something that might be inspiration or shame or simply the recognition of truth, I ask you to make a choice. Choose to remember. Choose to honor these sacrifices by living in ways that prove they were not wasted. Choose courage over comfort, loyalty over convenience, truth over the easy lies we tell ourselves to avoid responsibility. Choose to be worthy of the guardians who died protecting what they loved. Choose to be worthy of Lotte, who ran through hell carrying hope and refused to let it die. And above all, turn to God. Turn to Jesus Christ, whose love is the foundation of all other love, whose sacrifice gives meaning to every smaller sacrifice we make or witness. The courage that sent Lotte running through occupied France, the loyalty that bound Antoine Mercier to his mission even under torture, the love that made William Davies send his dog to protect his family, all of these flow from a deeper source. We are called to love as Christ loved, to serve as he served, to sacrifice as he sacrificed, not because it is easy or comfortable or safe, but because it is right, because love requires action, because faith without works is dead, because the gospel demands more than intellectual assent. It demands transformation that changes how we live and what we are willing to suffer for. Lotte's story is not just about a brave dog. It is about the image of God reflected in creation, about the capacity for good that exists even in a world shattered by evil, about the possibility of redemption and meaning and purpose, even in the darkest circumstances. It is about the choice we all face every day, to run toward the light or to hide in darkness, to protect what matters or to abandon it for safety, to keep promises or to rationalize our failures, to remember or to forget. Choose to remember, choose to honor, choose to follow the example set by a dog who ran through darkness carrying hope, and by the people who loved her enough to ask the impossible and to bear the cost when she delivered it. In Jesus' name, may we be worthy of their sacrifice. May we be brave enough to carry hope through our own darkness. May we be loyal enough to keep promises even when keeping them costs everything. May we be loving enough to protect what matters, to stand against evil, to refuse complicity with injustice. May we remember Lotta and the cliffs of Dover, and the mine-filled waters that were cleared because one dog refused to quit. May we remember, and in remembering, may we be changed. May we become people who understand that courage and love and sacrifice are not relics of a simpler time, but eternal truths that each generation must rediscover and recommit to. May we be worthy. May we remember. May we run through our own darkness carrying hope for others, refusing to quit, refusing to abandon what we have been called to protect. In Jesus' name, amen.